Once upon a time, there were two guys, a cartoonist and a magician. The cartoonist was an American, the magician an Englishman. Though very different, what the cartoonist and the magician had in common was that they both made comics, or comic books, as they're called in the United States. Just so it's clear, by a magician we're talking about a practitioner of the occult, not some lame stage magician pulling rabbits out of a hat. The cartoonist was a natural. If ever anyone was born to make comics, it was him. Cartoonist is a term for someone who both writes and draws a comic, and it could have been coined for this guy. He could draw as well as almost anyone in comics. He could write as well as almost anyone in comics. What he did better than anyone had ever done was amalgamate the two disciplines. His ability to communicate a story via the lines he put down on the page was otherworldly. With one genius mind handling both the writing and art, his comics were at once more sophisticated, yet more easily understood than those of his contemporaries or predecessors. Still so young, he quickly found himself at the forefront of the comics field, taking it places it had never been before. The mind boggled at what he might accomplish once he matured. Conversely, the magician was a literary genius. Had circumstances been different, he could have been a revered novelist, or a screenwriter, a playwright, perhaps even a poet. Through a twist of fate, his talent was channeled into his love of American superhero comics. Born to a working-class family in Northampton, he was a voracious reader. While devouring and appreciating the quality of what society deemed literature, that is, books, he had a special fondness for the exotic worlds depicted in the American superhero comics that found their way across the Atlantic. To a boy growing up in post-World War II England, these mythical beings from a far-off land were the most potent form of escapism from the dreariness of reality. The distance between the magician's native Northampton and New York City seemed almost as insurmountable as the divide between mundane life and superhero fantasies. As the home of Marvel Comics and DC Comics, New York was the epicenter of superhero comics. You had to be within striking distance of New York if you wanted to work in American comics. That was the major league. Marvel and DC were the big two of comics publishers. Not even the magician's fertile imagination could envision a plausible scenario whereby he might one day craft the adventures of the iconic superheroes he read about. Instead, he set his sights on the much more achievable and much less glamorous world of British comics. So it came to pass that in the late 1970s, two geniuses entered the field of comics. And writers at that. Sure, comics had had great artists before. Comics artists like Jack Kirby, Bernie Wrightson, and Moebius were all geniuses of a sort. But writing? Never. Great comics writing was considered an oxymoron. Comics were transient trash for juveniles. On sale for a month, then gone forever. To be reading them beyond puberty was socially unacceptable. Writing them was something to be ashamed of, not aspired to. If you were a serious writer, you wrote novels. Comics weren't a viable career choice. It didn't pay well and was more contemptuous than prestigious. The prevailing opinion in the industry was that the comics field was going away in a decade. That is, that the industry would cease to exist due to the failing economics. But despite all logic, the cartoonist and the magician loved superhero comics. They weren't aiming to make disposable distractions for 10-year-olds. They were intent on creating art for adults. And they had talent. Neither they, nor anyone else, had any notion of the impact they were to have on popular culture in the coming decades. The cartoonist's name was Frank Miller. The magician was Alan Moore. They are the unintentional architects of the superhero movie. Between them, Miller and Moore set in motion a chain of events that transformed the derided medium of comics into the hottest thing in Hollywood. And it all happened totally by accident. By late 1981, Frank Miller stood atop the field of superhero comics. Aged just 24 and a few years into his career, Miller was a critical and commercial darling. Miller's competitors in the ranks of comics professionals were mostly apathetic journeymen who fell into comics after failing to make it in their preferred careers, such as illustration, advertising art, or newspaper comic strips, or a new generation of rabid fanboys who grew up reading comics and wanted to work in the field more than anything, whether they had the talent to make a significant contribution or not. Miller, who had the talent and was ambitious, was an anomaly who stood out from the crowd. Growing up in rural Vermont, Miller had been one of those rabid comics fans. Born in 1957, he was just the right age to experience the superhero explosion of the 1960s. He didn't just want to read them, though. He liked to draw. From a young age, he knew he wanted to be a comics artist. At age 6, he told his mother he was going to draw comics for a living. By 15, he had submitted art to Marvel Comics, looking for work. Marvel sent the schoolboy a polite rejection letter. Miller knew what he must do to keep his dream alive.
What do you think is the best way for an aspiring artist or writer to break into professional comics?
Probably the first thing is I think you almost have to be in New York or able to come to New York constantly. You can send in work, you can mail it in, and eventually we get around to looking at it. We can try to make some small criticism, but really the way to get in, you have to keep coming around, keep showing your work, trying to be available, getting to know people in comics. You really have to be terribly persistent. If a person isn't persistent, generally they probably will never make it in. But mostly it's persistence and availability, besides being damn good.
Is it a buyer's market now? Are there openings for artists?
Right now, it's for anyone, I should say, for anyone that's good, there's always a place. Right now, I think they're kind of trying to level out the number of titles on the newsstands and things like that, so that we seem to have hit a period when there's not a terrific amount of work available, but still, anyone good, there's always a place for them.
At 19, Miller moved to New York City to take a shot at the big time. This was 1976. There was no internet. There was no digital art. Art was done in pencil and ink on large, stiff cardboard that the artist delivered to the offices of the comics publisher once complete. The most important ability for a comics artist was availability. You had to be in New York City. In later years, courier companies such as FedEx offered express delivery overnight, which gave artists a little more latitude when it came to geography. Then with the advent of the internet and the increasing use of computers, artwork was able to be scanned and uploaded to publishers or done entirely digitally. That was science fiction when the teenaged Frank Miller arrived in New York. Dad drove young Frank the 500 kilometers down from Vermont to New York. Miller had his dad drop him at a random street. He didn't want the old man to see the dive he'd be living in. His accommodation was a shared, cockroach-infested apartment in the Soho district of Manhattan. Miller arrived in the city with nothing to his name. Just a kid with a dream of being in comics to sustain him. To pay the rent, Miller took odd jobs doing what he describes as very bad carpentry. In his spare time, he continued to hone his artwork, taking samples to anyone that might be able to give him his first job. The key contact proved to be comics artist Neal Adams, who co-owned a commercial art studio named Continuity Associates, along with his business partner, Dick Giordano. Continuity Associates made most of its money from advertising art and movie storyboards, but it was full of guys who drew comics. Conveniently located on West 39th Street, between the offices of Marvel and DC Comics, the Continuity Associates office became something of a neutral clubhouse for artists that worked at the publishers. Neal Adams was a legendary figure, revered by many for his ability to draw photorealistic art beyond the capability of virtually every other artist in the field. Adams also had a larger-than-life personality and was not afraid to express his opinions. He was happy to give up his time to critique samples from those aspiring to enter the comics field. Unlike most, Adams did not sugarcoat his appraisals, bluntly calling it as he saw it. His reviews have been known to destroy young artists, forever demoralized by a scathing assessment from their idol. So it was that the young Frank Miller came to Continuity Associates for the first time. In his usual style, Adams took a look at Miller's art samples and declared them to be abominable. His advice to Miller: go back to Vermont, kid, and get a job pumping gas. Miller had suffered through similar judgments of his work before. A lesser committed man might have been broken by the crushing evaluation. Miller was hardy enough to take it as motivation to do better. He asked if he could return to Continuity Associates tomorrow with improved samples. Miller did come back tomorrow and many more times. Seeing the kid was robust and willing to learn, Adams took Miller under his wing and began to teach him. Adams would break out the tracing paper and place it over Miller's malformed human figures and demonstrate how it should be done. Miller began hanging out with the artists at Continuity, and Adams would throw Miller scraps of advertising work to help make ends meet. Initially, Miller just got to color the work of other artists before graduating to doing the artwork himself. When Adams felt Miller was ready, he made a call to Gold Key Comics, one of the smaller comics publishers in New York, and told them he was sending a kid down. The result was Miller's first printed comics job as a comics artist, a 3-page story in issue 84 of The Twilight Zone. Based on the old TV show, which had been canceled way back in 1964, The Twilight Zone was a title that nearly no one read, rapidly heading toward cancellation of its own. That issue was on sale in April of 1978. Meaning it had taken Miller a year or two of struggle after moving to New York to get his first paying gig. Miller's 3-page art job was amateurish, though still exceeded the lousy story he was given to illustrate. There was nothing to suggest a major talent had arrived. Payment for the job was $25 per page. Given how long Miller spent redrawing each page to get it as good as his meager skills would allow, he probably made $1 an hour. Still, with published work, he was now a genuine comics professional, meaning he had a calling card to show companies he was a serious artist. Miller was off to the races. Gold Key Comics was a minor publisher. The company's writers and artists really wanted to work for were the big two: Marvel Comics, home of Spider-Man, the Avengers and the X-Men, and DC Comics, home of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. They had the highest sales, so paid talent the most money. If you were a comics fan, which everyone trying to get into comics was, then they also owned all the iconic characters you wanted to work on. Marvel and DC were where it was at.
New York City, the Big Apple. Yep, here it's action, action, action. And the people never stop. That's the world of high finance for you. Yes, in these buildings, 2 huge corporations are battling it out right now for sales that total millions and millions of smackaroos a year. Is it ITT versus AT&T? Perhaps at the United Nations, the great powers battling it out. Is it NBC battling ABC? No. This is the battle between the comic book empires of DC and Marvel.
Shortly after his Gold Key debut, Miller started getting small assignments from DC Comics. Just short stories in meaningless books like Weird War Tales and Unknown Soldier, but it was a foot in the door. These were anthology titles, featuring stories from multiple writers and artists. DC often used then to try out new artists on a book where the stakes were low. It was a method of shepherding new talent into the business and slipping them a few bucks to sustain them through their apprenticeship. The nascent work is almost unrecognizable as Frank Miller art. Miller was at the earliest stages of his development and still figuring out what his style was. Neil Adams had a saying that your art style was the sum of all your mistakes that deviated your drawings from reality. Every page was a battle for Miller to get markings down on the page that communicated a story and could pass for a version of reality. There were mistakes aplenty, as it was for every new artist. After a few minor assignments, DC offered Miller a book of his own to draw. He had the opportunity to be the regular penciler on Claw the Unconquered. Yes, that really was what it was called. Claw, the lead character, was a bad rip-off of Conan the Barbarian. The sword and sorcery book was an irrelevant one, which nearly no one read or even cared that it existed. There was little to attract Miller to Claw the Unconquered outside of having a book of his own and a regular paycheck. So Miller went to Marvel editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, the head honcho, to see if there was a counteroffer from Marvel. DC Comics was a fading force when Frank Miller showed up on the scene in the late 1970s. As the home of the most iconic superheroes, DC had traditionally been the top-selling comics company for many decades. That was before Marvel Comics went on a run with its own heroes, beginning with the release of the Fantastic Four in 1961. It took a decade for Marvel to overtake DC, becoming the biggest seller of comics in the U.S. in 1972. By 1978, it wasn't even close. Marvel had left DC in its wake. For the majority of comics fans, Marvel was hip and cool, while DC was considered to be comics for your dad. Most of the good comics were coming out of Marvel. Most of the best talent was working for Marvel. That was the place to be. That was where Miller wanted to be. Jim Shooter didn't think Miller was quite ready for a regular book at Marvel. He saw enough promise in Miller that he offered to keep Frank in steady work with fill-ins, issues by a guest penciler slotted in to allow the regular penciler to keep a book releasing on a monthly schedule, until such time as a book of his own beckoned. Good enough. Miller went with Marvel. Miller got his first Marvel credit with issue 18 of John Carter, Warlord of Mars, which went on sale in August of 1978. Another licensed book, John Carter was a character in pulp novels written by Edgar Rice Burroughs that wasn't selling well and was nearing cancellation. Perfect fodder to try the new kid out on. It marked the first occasion he penciled a full printed comic, all 17 pages in this case. The issue looks good for a first Marvel effort. Miller's drawing has clearly improved since his time on The Twilight Zone. Aiding and abetting Miller was Bob McLeod on inks, no doubt helping to smooth off some of the rough edges of the newcomer's art. Bob McLeod was one of Marvel's best inkers. An inker's job was to go over pencil art in black ink, allowing it to be reproduced by the primitive printing technology used to manufacture comics, giving Miller's work a polished finish his prior jobs had lacked. Having passed his entry exam, Miller received more work from Marvel. This time he got a shot at a title of some significance, Spectacular Spider-Man. Spider-Man was Marvel's most popular character, starring in multiple titles that Marvel put out every month. Miller was assigned to draw 2 issues. Once again, Miller showed considerable improvement over his previous effort. The art remained wonky in places, but his storytelling sound. Unfortunately, the story Miller was illustrating was standard comics fare, which is to say dreck. Miller was looking forward to the chance to draw his favorite hero from childhood, with the added bonus of being paid to do so. While working on the issues, he found the guest star, Daredevil, the more compelling of the heroes. Daredevil was a perennially B-grade Marvel hero whose own book was fighting to avoid cancellation. The unique attribute of Daredevil was that his superpower was a disability. He was blind and had overdeveloped his other senses to compensate. Miller expressed an interest in drawing Daredevil's regular book if it ever became available. Coincidentally, the penciler of Daredevil's regular book quit soon thereafter. Jim Shooter, sufficiently pleased with Miller's progress, gave Miller the job. Miller now had his first regular assignment as the penciler of Daredevil. Drawing Daredevil's book certainly wasn't considered a coveted assignment. Daredevil had never been one of Marvel's more popular characters. Sometimes he was derided as a poor man's Spider-Man. And what kind of a superpower was blindness? Flight? Super strength? Teleportation? Bring it on. No kid went around wishing he could go blind. Sales on Daredevil's title reflected his place in the pecking order of Marvel heroes. The book had suffered the indignity of being reduced to bi-monthly status, meaning an issue came out every 2 months. A monthly release schedule was the norm for comics, which was one step removed from cancellation. Nothing particularly noteworthy had ever happened in the pages of Daredevil in the 157 issues before Miller came aboard. Miller joined the existing team of Roger McKenzie, writer, and Klaus Janson, inker. Roger McKenzie was another relative newcomer to comics who had been writing Daredevil for 7 issues before Miller's arrival. Klaus Janson was 5 years older than Miller and had already established himself as one of Marvel's best young inkers. Years before, He had paid his dues working as an assistant to Dick Giordano, the same Dick Giordano who co-owned Continuity Associates with Neil Adams, who was known as one of the best teachers in the business. Jansen was a strong talent to pair with Miller, ensuring the result would look decent even if the newbie dropped the ball. The credits to Daredevil 158 boldly declare, "From time to time, a truly great new artist will explode upon the Marvel scene like a bombshell. We confidently predict newcomer. Lanky Frank Miller is just such an artist." Absurd hype was commonplace in Marvel Comics. For once, the bombast proved to be prophetic. Understatement, even. Miller and Jansen were a good match from the get-go. On the surface, the art had an appealing sheen to it. At a fundamental level, Miller was still struggling to get to grips with elements of basics, such as anatomy and perspective. The sort of thing you might observe in any young artist just starting his career, encountering artistic problems and learning how to solve them on the fly, while keeping the book on schedule. Clearly, the kid was giving it everything he had. No doubt the bi-monthly schedule of Daredevil helped Miller, as he had twice as much time between issues that a monthly book did, with the caveat that he made only half the money. The next significant event in Miller's run on Daredevil was the arrival of Denny O'Neil as the editor on the book at the beginning of 1980. O'Neil had a reputation as one of the best writers in comics. Among his achievements was a seminal run on Batman in the early 1970s, illustrated by none other than Neil Adams. While Daredevil was looking fine, Roger McKenzie's stories were pedestrian affairs. Standard villain of the month slugfest repeating superhero tropes that had already been recycled dozens of times before. Miller was dissatisfied with the stories he was being asked to draw and began attempting to exert more control over the writing as his confidence in his position grew. The first issue in which Miller received a co-writer credit was number 165, his 8th issue on the title. Artistically and professionally ambitious, Miller appealed to O'Neil to remove McKenzie from the title and install Miller as writer/artist. O'Neil could see that this Miller kid had something. In issue 167, Miller had a backup story in the book written solely by himself. The story concludes with the narration, to relentlessly hone his skills and abilities. The passion to be the very best. Was Miller referring to Daredevil or to himself? Miller had asked O'Neil for the opportunity to write a short story. Essentially, it served as a tryout for Miller to see whether he had the chops to take on the writing chores. The arm wrestle for creative control culminated in issue 168, with Miller assuming writing duties and McKenzie off the book. Only on a temporary basis. There was no guarantee beyond the next issue. Miller was writing Daredevil until someone better could be found to replace McKenzie. It was rare to have a single person handling writing and art at Marvel or DC. For starters, there were very few creators who excelled in both disciplines. It was hard to draw well. It was hard to write well. It was exceptionally hard to do both to a high standard. Even where an individual was capable of both, the strict deadlines in comics generally precluded it. That was why comics creation was divided up into a production line, writer, artist, inker, to churn out periodicals at the required schedule. Books had to come out on time to serve a publisher's business needs. Quality was considered a bonus, but not essential. Miller wasted no time in implementing his ideas. In terms of overall tone, what he wanted to do was turn the Daredevil book into a crime comic. Miller was a huge fan of noir crime novels, as written by the likes of Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and Mickey Spillane. A lot of the art samples he'd carted around New York showing to publishers were of guys in trench coats, not superhero tights. Daredevil was a street-level character, so it was less of a stretch that he'd deal with mob bosses and henchmen than it would have been for cosmic heroes who flew and fired lasers from their hands. In Miller's first issue as writer/artist, he introduced a new character, Elektra, a female assassin who could hold her own against Daredevil. She was villain, love interest, and femme fatale all rolled into one. She spelled trouble for both Daredevil and his secret identity, Matt Murdock, a lawyer who crusaded for justice in court by day while Daredevil fought crime at night. Miller had intended her to appear only once, but he fell in love with the character, and she became a series regular. Readers fell in love with Elektra, too. Word of mouth is the best advertising there is in comics. Buzz quickly began to build among fans. There was a hot, young artist on Daredevil, and now stories to match the art. Sales trended upward with each issue. Elektra was a breakout character. She was the coolest new character to come along in years. Frank Miller was all of 23 years old while this was happening, still learning his craft. On the writing side, he had mentors in Denny O'Neil, Daredevil editor, and Jim Shooter, Marvel editor-in-chief. Jim Shooter was a comics industry veteran at the ripe old age of 29. He got his first professional writing gig with DC Comics at the unbelievable age of 13. His family needed the money. Teenage Jim Shooter came up with a cockamamie scheme to write comics to help the family make ends meet. A lot of clueless teens have probably had similar notions. Difference is, Jim Shooter pulled it off. His first script was accepted, and he wrote Superman comics through high school. Dreamy as it sounds, it didn't feel like a fairy tale for young Jim Shooter, who felt he was suffering under his tyrannical editor, Mort Weisinger. The Shooter family needed the money, so Jim had no option other than to obey Weisinger's edicts and absorb the tirades when they came. Shooter had become editor-in-chief of Marvel at the age of 26 and set about trying to impose order on what had been a chaotic workplace. He got titles on schedule and hired a team of editors to serve underneath him that enabled Marvel to expand its comics line. Under Shooter, Marvel extended its sales lead over DC and widened the chasm between the quality of Marvel's books and the competition. Shooter also had strict rules about how a writer should structure a story and how an artist should tell that story. Though he despised Weisinger, Shooter had assimilated more from his teacher than he could bring himself to acknowledge. The result was a man many described as complex. In his early issues, Shooter's fundamentals were a useful tool for a Miller learning how to weave stories and compose a panel or lay out a page. It would not be long before Miller would outgrow Shooter's rules, as the pupil became a master. On the artistic front, Miller was finding inspiration from a source that other American comics artists had not yet discovered. Miller had a girlfriend named Lori Sutton, who also worked in comics. Sutton's father traveled to Japan on business and picked up some of the local comics to bring back as gifts. This was years before Japanese comics, which everyone now knows as manga, were available in the United States. Lori Sutton gave Miller a phone book-thick tome with a painting of a samurai on it. The manga Frank Miller got via Sutton's father was Lone Wolf and Cub by Kazuo Koike, writer, and Goseki Kojima, artist. It was in Japanese, and Frank Miller did not speak Japanese. The amazing thing Miller found was that it did not matter. He could understand the story just from the pictures. There's a world of lessons here for a keen pupil. Miller took note. Lone Wolf and Cub changed the way he drew, laid out panels on a page, and how he told a story. Manga ultimately became big in the U.S. a couple of decades later. Miller was way out in front of the curve. The principal villain of Miller's run was a mob boss known as the Kingpin. Kingpin was a Spider-Man villain that Miller co-opted. Up until Miller got his hands on him, Kingpin had been something of a joke. His defining characteristic was that he was essentially a ball of fat, as wide as he was tall. Under Miller, that fat became a flabby veneer covering slabs of solid muscle. The Kingpin could take down a dozen armed men if pressed. Powerful as his body might be, Kingpin's menace came from his mind and its machinations. His first appearance in Miller's run found the Kingpin holed up in a mansion in Japan, where else, with the rest of New York's crime bosses placing a contract on his head. With issue 171, Daredevil shifted from a bi-monthly schedule to monthly, reflecting increasing sales and the buzz around the book. There was no way Miller was going to be replaced as writer now. Frank Miller was living his dream. Young, acclaimed, living in New York doing the thing he'd wanted to do since childhood. Miller, a kid from the country, felt at home in New York. He would take to the rooftops with his sketch pad and draw, gathering reference to ensure his skylines were accurate when Daredevil swung between buildings. Miller lived in an apartment on 13th Street in the West Village section of Lower Manhattan. Klaus Janson lived just 3 or 4 blocks away in an apartment on Perry Street. Occasionally, they would visit each other to talk shop or just chat. There were also trips into the Marvel offices at 575 Madison Avenue to drop off or collect artwork. It was an opportunity for Miller to go to lunch with Denny O'Neil to figure out the nuances of the next issue's story, or discuss the medium of comics with Jim Shooter. Occasionally, Miller might pick up an additional assignment, where his Daredevil schedule allowed it, drawing a front cover for another comic here or there to supplement his income. The one thing Miller wasn't getting from living his dream on Daredevil was rich. All writers and artists at Marvel and DC were paid a flat page rate, regardless of sales. Miller's page rate had no doubt received a few bumps since starting on Daredevil based on the results he was producing, but that was it. No royalties based on sales figures were paid. The incentive to do good work was largely personal pride, as you were paid the same whether the job was good or bad. Why bother to go the extra mile? Superhero comics were on store shelves for a month, then disappeared, never to be seen again. Editors gave out assignments, so work just had to be good enough to get you your next gig. Only a few creators were intrinsically driven like Miller, looking to push themselves and the art form. Miller was struggling to keep pace with a monthly schedule. Something had to give. From issue 173 onwards, Klaus Janson took more responsibility for the artwork. Miller was providing breakdowns, rough drawings that tell the story, while Janson is credited with finished art, doing the final drawing and inking it. Janson took it a step further and started coloring the book as well with issue 179. Coloring was usually an afterthought in superhero comics. The coloring technique employed was rudimentary and the printing process crude to keep costs down. It was very difficult to achieve results that added anything to the line art. Janson was one of the few skillful enough to make the coloring another meaningful tool in his artistic arsenal. That he cared enough to take the time showed he too was all in on Daredevil. Miller cared so much he was even putting together the letter column in the back of each issue of Daredevil. He read all the mail received from fans, selected those to be printed, and wrote printed replies. Usually, letter columns were the responsibility of the editor or assistant editor of a book. It was unusual for the writer to assemble them. In the time pre-internet, letters and sales figures were the only direct feedback available to creators. As he hit his stride on the Daredevil book, Miller defines his core characters, making them seem more real than the cardboard cutouts universally seen in comics. Daredevil, our hero, fighting to save his city, his life, his soul. Elektra, sometimes she fought alongside Daredevil, sometimes she tried to kill him. Kingpin, the master manipulator pulling all the strings. Mind like a general, body like a tank. He has only one weakness: love. Bullseye, Miller converted a lame villain of the month whose shtick was that he was good at throwing any object into a lethal assassin for hire. Out to kill Daredevil and Elektra, nonchalantly terminating anyone who gets in his way. Total psychopathic killer. Scary. We meet Stick, the blind martial artist who trained Daredevil, and his enemy, a clan of mystical ninjas known as the Hand. Ninjas were everywhere in Miller's Daredevil. In the early 1980s, ninjas were new, hip, and cool, especially in the hands of Frank Miller. There seemed to be more ninjas on the streets of New York than there were in the whole of Japan. Who cares? Miller made it awesome. There was a staggering fight where Elektra killed the Hand's mightiest assassin, Kirigi, by running him through with a katana. Or so it seemed. In their next encounter, Elektra made sure of the job by decapitating Kirigi. Now there was no coming back for Kirigi. Or so it seemed. The choreography of Miller's fight scenes was brutal ballet. Fights in other comics had the hero wisecracking as the protagonists playfully win at it, as if there were nothing at stake. Miller's fight scenes took place in savage silence, as the combatants tried to rip each other's throat out. Denny O'Neil encouraged Miller to come up with a distinctive fighting style for Daredevil. Miller's fights flowed. There was peril. When someone got hit, it hurt. It felt real. In 1981, Frank Miller began working out of an art studio on West 29th Street. The studio was a collective of a few artists who jokingly called themselves upstart associates. Each artist had a drawing board, working on their own projects and paying their share of rent for the space. Miller was invited to replace the departing Jim Starlin, joining Walt Simonson, Howard Chaykin, and Jim Sherman in the studio. Simonson and Chaykin were also writers/artists, about a decade older than Miller and partway through Hall of Fame careers of their own. Many artists prefer to work in a studio environment rather than from their home. It helped to delineate their working life from the remainder of their life. The chance for social interaction was also appealing. Drawing was otherwise a lonely occupation, with many hours logged at the drawing board in solitude. Simonson and Chaykin were talkative types that were interesting to be around. Simonson liked to tell stories. Chaykin liked to argue. He enjoyed being provocative and making people think. Both were thoughtful when it came to analyzing what made comics tick. It was through his upstart studio mates that Miller was first exposed to the work of Moebius. Moebius, whose real name was Jean Giroux, was a highly influential French comics artist whose work appeared in Metal Hurlant magazine in France. Heavy Metal magazine was its U.S. counterpart, amongst other places. Much beloved and copied, Moebius was also sought after by Hollywood, doing design and storyboarding work on films such as Alien and Tron. Miller became entranced by the art of Moebius, though its influence on his art would not be seen in Daredevil. That would have to wait. A new comics shop, Forbidden Planet, opened in 1981, instantly becoming the best in New York City. Part of what made it so good was the European comics it stocked. Fans and comics professionals now had a location where they could readily access the work of Europeans. One of the titles on the shelves was 2000 AD, a weekly British comics anthology containing early work from Alan Moore. Miller shopped at Forbidden Planet, studying Moebius and other European artists such as Enki Bilal and Hugo Pratt. New York City was central to Miller's Daredevil. This was the seedy New York of the 1970s, as seen in films like Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. A city on the brink of bankruptcy. A city where the kingpin could operate with impunity, as did the bosses of New York's 5 mafia families. A city that desperately needed a daredevil. One of Jim Shooter's maxims as editor-in-chief was that making good comics is what shifted units. If a book wasn't selling, it was likely because the quality wasn't up to snuff. Prior to Miller coming on board, Daredevil was one of Marvel's worst-selling titles, selling around 111,000 copies per issue. The bean counters were telling Shooter to cancel it. By the time Miller was done, Daredevil was shifting over 250,000 copies. That put it in Marvel's top 5 books, along with the likes of X-Men, the perennial bestseller, Fantastic Four, drawn by the most popular artist in comics, John Byrne, Avengers featuring a swag of Marvel's big characters, and Spider-Man, Marvel's best-known character. In the space of less than 3 years, the book went from the brink of cancellation to the top. In terms of quality, it was widely considered to be the best superhero book on the market. Daredevil had gone from a character no one cared about to Marvel's most fascinating character. Elektra was the brightest star to come into the Marvel Universe in years. All this from an unknown kid on his first book. Wow. A couple of cartoonists from Dover, New Hampshire, were among those buying and digging Miller's Daredevil. They liked it so much that they decided to put together a parody comic. Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird wrote and drew what was initially a crude parody of Miller's Daredevil with the wacky name Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The name was poking fun at what was popular in the comics market at the time. Teenage superheroes were hot. Mutants were hot, with the X-Men the #1 book. Ninjas were hot. Turtles were definitely not hot. Eastman and Laird had no chance of a company publishing their comic, so they scrounged together what little money they could and published the first issue themselves. Between Kevin's tax return, the little Peter had in the bank, and a loan from Kevin's uncle, they scratched together enough to have 3,275 copies printed, more than they thought they could ever sell. The concept was too niche, violent, and weird to take off. Except it did. For reasons no one can explain, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles went ballistic and became a worldwide phenomenon. Forget comics. There were cartoons, toys, movies, Eastman and Laird won the lottery and became rich beyond their wildest dreams. Amid the hubbub, only comics nerds knew the Turtles were an inside joke having fun with Frank Miller's Daredevil. Towards the end of 1981, after he had been writing Daredevil for almost a year, Frank Miller realized how the Elektra saga he had been chronicling must end. During a meeting with Denny O'Neil, Miller said that Elektra would have to die. No, that could not happen, O'Neil told him. Why not? Miller laid out his argument as to why it simply had to happen. If Elektra lived, she would become fodder for the Marvel Universe, like all the other characters. Join the merry-go-round of repeating the same stories over and over again without ever reaching a resolution. Comic stories had no endings. They were eternal soap operas. If stories had endings, publishers would have to cease publishing titles. Economic reality necessitated otherwise. Miller felt it was better for Elektra to die a meaningful death than live an insipid life. That was what the story demanded. To the 24-year-old Frank Miller, death was an abstract, distant concept, as it is to nearly all 20-somethings. It would be decades before Miller would become familiar with the anxiety induced by death's icy breath on the back of his neck. At 42, Denny O'Neil was better acquainted with death. He had a history of alcoholism and heart problems. He needed this job as an editor at Marvel, not least the health insurance tied to his employment. It was no secret that Denny O'Neil and Jim Shooter were not on good terms. For O'Neil, financial pragmatism outweighed youthful romanticism. Elektra was more popular than Daredevil, O'Neil explained to Miller. Jim Shooter, the man in charge, would never allow her to die. She was too valuable to the company. Well, let's find out, Miller said, and headed off down the corridor to Shooter's office. Across the Atlantic in England, Alan Moore was one of those reading and admiring the work of Frank Miller. Moore had plans of his own for minting. He had his own take on what the definitive superhero story might be. Not long after the debut of Superman in 1938, superheroes started to show up on the screen. The poor standard of special effects made them difficult to depict. Comics had unlimited special effects budgets, with the only limitation being the imagination of the creative team. After decades of movie serials, TV shows, and animation, the first superhero movie to make a mark was Superman, the movie in 1978. An absolute gem that had no right to be as good, given nearly all of the intended audience believed the subject matter to be stupid and juvenile. What Superman had going for it was Richard Donner's sincerity, Christopher Reeve, and top-notch special effects for the time. Donner's mantra for the movie was verisimilitude, meaning Superman was treated as if he were real. The respect for the character overturned decades of silliness in the comics and adaptations. Christopher Reeve's Superman is a miracle. You believe this actor in tights is Superman. Should have got an Academy Award for pulling that off, even if his Clark Kent performance is not of the same caliber. And the special effects were groundbreaking for their day, making the movie a spectacle capable of awing. During production, the special effects crew was literally inventing how to portray a man flying on the big screen as they went along. The poster promised, "You'll believe a man can fly," and you did. Superman 2 is perhaps even better, freed of the burden of having to tell the origin. The unfettered action of Superman against three similarly powerful Kryptonians remains some of the best combat scene in a superhero movie. There's a lot wrong with the Superman movies, but what they do right is so well done it doesn't matter in the end. The Superman movies did not immediately spawn a slew of imitators hoping to cash in. Superman was seen as the king of superheroes, with global name recognition up there with Mickey Mouse or Santa Claus. Superheroes were stupid, and the Superman movies were an anomaly. Warner Communications, the owner of DC, did not see value in the catalog of characters DC had. The best Marvel comics, who were under the ownership of a company named Cadence Industries, could do were a few bad TV movies.